all eyes were on the body language. A reluctant hug or a warm embrace. Notice Narendra Modi's arm around Volodymyr Zelenskyy. The Indian Prime Minister appeared to be doing the heavy lifting, because in the eyes of Kyiv, he's on thin ice. It was 6 weeks ago that Russian bombing across Ukraine killed dozens, with a children's hospital in the capital among the buildings hit. Yet as kids clung to their parents in fear, Mr. Modi was embracing President Putin in Moscow. A disgusted Zelenskyy said he was disappointed to see the leader of the world's largest democracy hug the world's most bloody criminal. No wonder then that on this trip, Modi was taken to a memorial display in honor of the children killed since Russia's invasion.
I think that India began to recognize that this is not just conflict, this real war of one man, and his name is Putin, against whole country, which name is Ukraine. And you're a big country, you have big influence, and you can stop Putin.
As Moscow continues its assault in Donetsk in eastern Ukraine, India has still not directly criticized Russia for its invasion. New Delhi has always enjoyed good relations with the Kremlin, and India still relies on Russia for weaponry and oil. At the same time, India does not want to be dependent on any one ally and needs to counter the rise of China on its doorstep.
If you think about India's needs for its economic transformation, for its security against countries, they're increasingly seeing the West, the US in particular, but also Europe and other Asian partners as crucial. And so the weight of the West has grown in that portfolio of partners. Russia has not disappeared, but its significance for India, its utility for India has decreased.
Hence, before Ukraine, Modi visited Poland, building his Western clout. He's now pivoting to peacemaker, urging Zelenskyy to sit down for talks with Putin, saying India can help broker a deal.
I want to assure you that India is ready to play an active role in any efforts towards peace. If I can play any role in this personally, I will do that. I want to assure you as a friend.
But what does Ukraine want? One of Zelenskyy's advisors said it was important to build relations with a country that has a certain influence over Moscow, and it gives a chance for Kyiv to send a message.
The Ukrainians, by having not just Modi there, but also the Indian media, recognize that they have a way to speak to the Indian public about, A, what the Russians have done, and to push back against this notion that's prevalent in India, that somehow this is the West's war that Ukraine is fighting, that is conveying to an Indian public that this is Ukrainians fighting for their own country.
As the Indian leader made his way to a memorial for Mahatma Gandhi, is there any chance for non-violence now? This was a brief visit, but an historic one, the first by an Indian Prime Minister to an independent Ukraine. Both nations will hope this is the start of a new era of friendlier relations as they both figure out their next move.
Well, Dr. Chitij Bajpai is a Senior Research Fellow for South Asia at the Chatham House think tank. I spoke to him earlier and began by asking him about the significance of Modi's visit today.
The primary purpose of Modi's visit to Ukraine is to reaffirm India's relations with the West, given that this comes in the aftermath of Modi's visit to Moscow just over a month ago, which, as you'll know, this coincided with these Russian airstrikes in Ukraine and came just before or just ahead of the NATO summit that took place in Washington, D.C. The West has been largely sympathetic of India's position or its relationship with Russia in terms of its dependence on discounted Russian crude. We've seen a significant increase in the import of Russian crude from less than 2% of India's total imports before the war to over 40% since the war began, and its heavy dependence on Russian military hardware. So over 50% of India's in-service military platforms are of Russian origin. But the optics of Modi hugging Putin while we saw this airstrike on a children's hospital in Ukraine, I think that has led to a degree of damage control on New Delhi's part, which is what has prompted this visit to Ukraine.
I mean, it's a difficult balancing act he's trying to carry out here, isn't it? Because exactly about that visit, that hug, Zelenskyy described it as a devastating blow to see the leader of the world's largest democracy hug the world's most bloody criminal. Yet today, Zelenskyy, whether by choice or not, we're not quite clear, had to hug Mr. Modi himself. But that cannot have been an easy visit.
Yes, I agree. I think India has tried to maintain a relatively nuanced position on the war, so it's neither condemned nor condoned Russia's actions. But that being said, India's position in terms of its actual actions, we've seen India abstain in UN resolutions condemning Russia's actions in Ukraine. It didn't sign on to a joint communique that was produced at a peace conference that took place in Switzerland earlier this year, in June of this year. And during India's G20 presidency, we saw that the leaders' declaration that was produced had no mention of Russian actions in Ukraine. So I think there has been and continues to be a bit of a gap between the statements and the substance on India's position on the war.
And that gap is very, very unlikely to be closed, isn't it? Because exactly as you say, it's saying it takes a position of peace, but it has been very closely allied to Russia for many years now.
Russia remains a key strategic partner for India. That being said, I think the relationship is undergoing a degree of what I would call a managed decline. We're seeing an attempt by India to reduce its dependence on Russian military hardware. We're seeing that India is increasingly estranged or aloof, or essentially the odd man out in forums in which Russia plays a prominent role. And I think this reflects the fact that India, or under Modi, is trying to promote a more benign worldview, which is non-Western, but not explicitly anti-Western, unlike, say, Russia, China, or Iran.
And in terms of what you think directly, I mean, as you've hinted, the optics of these things are very, very important. You know, he's hugging Zelenskyy today, this idea of sort of messaging to the West. What does he hope it will deliver for him?
First and foremost, I think it reaffirms Modi's status as a global statesman in the aftermath of the recently concluded Indian parliamentary elections, in which Modi's party, the BJP, didn't perform as strongly as it had hoped. I think it reaffirms India's credentials as a rising and more responsible global power, which we've seen from its G20 presidency across to its space program. And also we've seen under the Modi government this attempt to promote this idea of India as a Vishwamitra, which means a friend of the world. And as, again, this sort of reaffirms this idea that India wants to play the role of a potential bridging power. In theory, India is very well positioned to play the role of a potential peace builder or a mediator. It's a country which maintains good relations with both the US and Russia. That being said, I don't think India has so far demonstrated the means or the motivation to play any sort of peace-building role. I think its actions have been largely driven by self-interest. I think we've seen other countries such as Turkey and even China have offered more substantive potential peace proposals. And I think Ukraine would also be skeptical of India's role as a potential peace builder, given India's long-standing and close relationship with Moscow.
Dr. Bajpai, thank you very much for talking to us today.
Thank you for having me.